He was just driving home after a long day, an elderly black man behind the wheel of a modest car. No crime, no reason to be stopped. Yet flashing lights filled his rearview mirror, pulling him into a moment that would test more than patience. It would test dignity. A routine traffic stop quickly spiraled into something darker, something far too familiar. But what the officer didn't know was that the man he tried to humiliate carried a power that could change everything. What happens when prejudice collides with hidden authority? It was a quiet evening in the city, the kind of night that felt routine, almost forgettable. Judge Henry Wallace had spent decades in the courtroom, earning respect through wisdom, fairness, and an unshakable commitment to justice. But outside those walls, he lived a life of simplicity, preferring an old, reliable sedan over luxury and choosing peace over power whenever he could. At 72, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen history change, yet still bore the scars of the struggles that came before. That evening, Henry was simply on his way home. The courthouse lights had long dimmed, and the streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional car rolling past. He adjusted the radio dial, humming softly, thinking only of dinner waiting at home and the comfort of a familiar chair. Nothing about his drive suggested danger. Nothing suggested that within moments he would become the center of a confrontation that exposed something deeply broken in the system he had dedicated his life to upholding. For all his years on the bench, for all the authority his robe carried inside the courtroom, out here he was just another black man behind the wheel. And to the officer watching him from the shadows, that was all that seemed to matter. The blue and red lights cut through the night, bouncing across the windshield like a warning flare. Henry's heart sank, not from guilt, but from the familiar dread he had carried his entire life. He had done nothing wrong. He knew that. Yet he also knew how quickly nothing could turn into something dangerous when judgment wasn't based on truth, but on skin. He pulled over calmly, easing his sedan onto the shoulder. The quiet hum of the engine seemed too loud in the silence that followed. Behind him, the patrol car idled, headlights glaring into his mirror like unblinking eyes. Seconds stretched into an eternity before the officer stepped out, boots striking the pavement with deliberate weight, each step a reminder of the power imbalance looming closer. Henry adjusted his hands, resting them high on the steering wheel where they could be seen. He had taught his grandchildren this ritual of survival. Keep your hands visible, make no sudden moves, speak softly, no matter the tone thrown at you. Tonight, those lessons were no longer distant warnings. They were his reality. The officer approached with a flashlight, its beam slicing through the car window and landing on Henry's face. The light lingered, not in search of danger, but in judgment, sizing him up. License and registration. The words were sharp, commanding, absent of courtesy. Henry complied slowly, narrating each movement. He knew better than to argue, but even as he handed over the documents, the officer's expression didn't soften. Instead, suspicion deepened. Questions piled on. Where was he going? Why was he out this late? Did this car really belong to him? They weren't inquiries. They were accusations disguised as protocol. What should have been a routine stop began to stretch, twisting into humiliation. The officer called for backup, though there was no threat. A second patrol car arrived, lights flashing, sirens briefly piercing the air before fading into a suffocating silence. Now, two sets of eyes studied him, as if his very existence demanded justification. Henry's chest tightened, not with fear for himself, but with anger at the familiarity of it all. After decades of fighting for justice, after ruling on cases meant to dismantle the very systems of bias standing before him, here he was, reduced to nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of those sworn to protect. And still, the officer pressed harder. "Step out of the car." The words were final, leaving no room for refusal. Henry hesitated for a split second, not out of defiance, but out of the weight of the moment. He knew too well the risks of hesitation, yet he also knew that stepping out placed him one breath closer to a danger he couldn't control. The night air hit his face as he stood beside the car, the flashing lights painting his skin in alternating shades of red and blue. Two officers stood over him, one hand resting far too comfortably near a holstered weapon. The road was empty, but Henry felt exposed, stripped of dignity, forced into a role he didn't choose. What neither of those officers knew, however, was that the man they were treating like a suspect held a power that would soon shift the ground beneath their feet. The cold air pressed heavy against Henry's chest as he stood beside his car, the harsh glow of patrol lights flashing across his face. One officer circled him slowly, like a predator testing its prey, while the other barked orders with an edge sharp enough to cut. "Hands on the hood! Now!" Henry obeyed, his palms pressing against the chilled metal. The humiliation burned deeper than the cold. He had once stood in courtrooms where his word carried the weight of law, where silence fell when he entered. But here, in the shadow of flashing lights, none of that mattered. To these men, he was stripped of his title, his dignity, his humanity, reduced to nothing more than a target of suspicion. The officer's hands searched him roughly, as if trying to find guilt that wasn't there. The questions grew harsher, accusations cloaked as inquiries. "Where'd you get this car? Who really owns it?" Every word dripped with prejudice, every gesture laced with authority abused. Henry's heart pounded, not from fear of guilt, but from the knowledge of how fragile life could become in moments like these. He thought of names that had become headlines, of lives ended in traffic stops that never should have escalated. He felt the weight of history pressing down, reminding him that even decades of service to justice couldn't shield him from the reality of racism. One officer's hand hovered near his weapon, a silent threat that hung in the night air. Time seemed to freeze. Any wrong move, any hesitation, any misinterpreted breath could have been his last. And then it happened. As the flashlight caught the edge of the leather wallet in his jacket pocket, the officer yanked it free and flipped it open. His badge, the unmistakable seal of the highest court in the nation, glimmered in the harsh light. The air shifted. Silence. Shock. The predator's confidence faltered. The hunted was no ordinary man. He was a Supreme Court judge. But the real question lingered. Would the revelation of his identity change anything, or had the damage already been done? The silence after the reveal was heavier than any words. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their authority cracking under the weight of recognition. Stammers replaced commands. Respect, forced and shallow, suddenly appeared where only suspicion and contempt had stood moments before. But Henry knew that no badge, no robe, no title could erase what had already been done. He drove home that night, the road stretching endlessly before him. On the surface, the incident was over. No arrest, no violence, no headline. Yet inside, a deeper wound lingered. Because the truth was painfully clear, if he had not carried that badge, if his name had not carried power, the night could have ended very differently. Henry sat in his chair, staring into the quiet of his home, the weight of generations pressing on his shoulders. For all his years upholding the law, he realized how fragile justice truly was when filtered through bias. And he thought of the countless others who never had the chance to prove who they were before their story ended too soon. This wasn't just his story. It was a reflection of a system where dignity can be stripped away in seconds, where respect is conditional, and where survival often depends on luck, titles, or proof of worth. He had lived to see the morning. But the question burned brighter than ever. How many others won't? And as you hear this story, ask yourself, what does it say about the world we live in, when even the highest judge in the land can be judged unworthy because of the color of his skin? Maybe the more urgent question is this: how many more stories like this must we tell before real justice truly exists?